Hopefully not, but like if you're taking a language, maybe there might be classes on Friday, especially the language classes. But let's see how we do today, because I have a feeling I've overbooked us anyway. So anything that we don't cover today, we'll just roll over for next week. There's a little bit of room next week so that I don't feel pressured to like, we need to cover everything today. So a few things. I'm going to share my screen to show you, go to the class website. So I am almost done. Sorry about the blue box. I'm almost done grading the Canvas assignment from last week with the oral history analysis. Most of the comments that I'm giving people on that one is just tell me more, explain yourself, explain your answers. So most of you are already on the right track. I just want more of what you're already writing. And I'm noticing that for the image analysis, the Canvas assignment for this weekend, I think what's going to give you all a little bit more of a hard time is the second image, right? We talked a little bit about image 1 on Tuesday. So a lot of what you all were noticing on this part of the image was really spot on. Like that's the kind of thing I want, the kind of analysis I want in your answers. But notice that the title of that political cartoon is "What Shall We Do with Our Boys?" Don't ignore the title of it and then this other part of the image, right? Because it's also part of the message that goes into this other part, right? But I want to talk a little bit about image 2. Image 2, I have not read the book it comes from in terms of this comes from a book that's supposed to be a post-apocalyptic novel of California, right? So if I'm telling you that this is from a book talking about a dystopian future in which an unassimilated Chinese immigrant has been elected to high office, right? So this is a dystopian post-apocalyptic book in which the governor of California is being depicted as a Chinese immigrant, right? If I'm giving you that information, right, which is not necessarily there in the image itself, what do you see? What do you think is going on in this particular image? Any thoughts?
It just like further hammers the idea like, oh, immigrants are gonna come in and take our jobs. So to them, that's like a post-apocalyptic scenario because then they won't have control, and it's more like the immigrants are going to have control of this country, which is bad.
Yes, CJ, that's exactly it. And Gian in the chat is saying anti-immigrant sentiment of immigrants taking over. Yes, and notice how the Chinese man being depicted here is depicted. It's meant to be read clearly as Chinese, right? He's meant to be understood as being Chinese. The facial features, the hat, the clothing, the fan in his hand. All of that's supposed to scream Chinese immigrant to somebody that is looking at this picture. But what about the rest of his surroundings? Do the rest of his surroundings scream China?
No.
No, right? So this is meant to be a huge contrast, right? For somebody looking at this image in the 1880s, let me check. 1880 is exactly when that book came out. It's supposed to be a clash. They're supposed to be jarring, right? Somebody who's looking at this image is supposed to be uncomfortable reading it, right? In fact, in the novel, I'm going to tell you a little bit more of the novel because it's relevant, right, to our understanding of this particular image, right? So this comes straight from the novel. If we throw wide our doors and invite these Asiatic people to a full, free, equal competition with us for supremacy, I just warn you, we shall be worsted. They're not all grammatically maybe correct, but the idea is in this post-apocalyptic book is that there is going to be a race war, right? And that the Chinese would emerge victorious in a war of the races, right? And it's warning that Americans had to avoid this, right? And so there is a key implication then that I want to see you all discuss there. But the other thing is then, what is this saying about whiteness? Right? What do you think? Any ideas? What does this tell us about whiteness, or the definition of whiteness at this time? It might seem too basic, but just at a basic level, do Chinese immigrants here count as white?
No.
No. And this is a really interesting thing that I'll discuss in my in the PowerPoint slides in a second. The other thing to note, right, that is that at this time, right, we can see the number of Chinese immigrants coming into the U.S. In this graph. And you might want to zoom in on some of this when you're looking at it, but you see that it was highest right before the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? But overall, the Chinese population in the US at this time made up less than 1%. Less than 1%. Now, part of it is because most of the Chinese immigrants in the country were concentrated in the West Coast. So if you were not living in the West Coast, you probably, chances of you being worried about Chinese immigration were lower because you're not seeing people. So maybe people that in the West Coast were more worried about it because they're seeing it more. But even in the West Coast, they weren't, Chinese immigrants, one, were not everywhere yet. They don't come to Los Angeles, for example, in significant numbers until later in the 1800s. Most Chinese immigrants were concentrated in Northern California, in part because that's where a lot of the gold mines were and where a lot of the work was, the railroad and that kind of work. But even taking that into account, the percentage of people in the West Coast that where Chinese immigrants was pretty low, right? So it's not like people were worried, this fear of being overrun, of California being overrun or the West Coast being overrun by Chinese immigrants really is disproportionate to the number of people that were actually here. Which tells us, okay, then there's something else going on, right? And it really is about race, right? It really is about race. And we see the racism play out in legal ways, right? One, in the culture of what is happening, right? Chinese immigrants are being called all kinds of racist names. They're being described as heathen, morally inferior, savage, but also childlike and lustful. Right. And this I want to point out something that a lot of you are identifying in the readings for this weekend, that a lot of the racist attitudes towards one group do end up translating to other groups, right? This is the same kind of language you see that is going to be used against Mexicans in the US, against Black people in the US. Like, it's the same language. And so that's an important thing that you are all already noticing in the readings and in the material, that once it works really against one group, it tends to be extended then to other groups. And key there is this need in the 1800s of really defining whiteness. Right? They're trying to define whiteness in a cultural way in terms of who is acceptable and who's not, but also in legal terms, right? Because a lot of U.S. law at the time was clear about kind of enslaved people. It ends up actually clarifying then the role of even free Black people after the Civil War. But there's an attempt to also then legally exclude all other groups, right? In 1880, so this is at the same time that all this anti-Chinese immigrant feeling is happening, we get a case that ends up legally defining and making marriage between a white person and a non-white person illegal. right? And it's interesting that case ends up setting a precedent because it defines who doesn't count as white, right? It says that marriage between a white person and then non-white people, the way it's defined in that 1880 law was Negro, mulatto, or Mongolian. Now, notice this is important because one, it actually does not include Latinos in any way, shape, or form, or what the majority of the population in the US at the time would have been Mexican. So it does not include Mexican as part of the legal other here. Right. So actually, a marriage between a white person and a Mexican person is legal at this time. It is legal. Right. And we'll see later that the cases that dismantle these laws are usually don't involve Latinos. Or when it does involve Latino, it's a Latino who is being read as a legal white person. But all right, when Asian American or when Chinese immigrants are looking at this law, they're going to claim, actually, this does not include Chinese immigrants. Right? It says, why not? Because Chinese people are not Mongolian. They don't come from the region of Mongolia. And so Chinese immigrants do sue within the US courts to try to say, hey, this does not include us, right? Also, indigenous people, that where do indigenous people fall into this category of other? They don't count. A lot of indigenous people would not have counted as Negro, mulatto, or Mongolian here. So the courts had to decide, well, okay, where do these other groups that don't necessarily fit into this legal definition, where do they fall into the legal system? Well, in 1854, a case, People v. Hall, had decided that actually you don't have to be specifically named in this law. That basically a lot that Black, Negro, and Indian people could all be considered other, right? Other as the other opposing whiteness, not white, right? Let me see if I have the case. I don't have the case here, but there's also a case in which a Chinese immigrant sued the state of California and claimed that they had a legal right to citizenship because they were not Negro, mulatto, Indian, or Mongolian. What do you think the courts decided? Did they decide that the Chinese immigrant had a case, that they did not count as other? Or did they do the opposite? Did they say, nope, you don't count as white?
Can you repeat the question, please?
So in this case where a Chinese immigrant sues the state of California claiming that they count as white because they're not in the law, it never says Chinese immigrants don't count as white. It says Negroes, mulattoes, Mongolians, Indians. They don't count as white. It does not say anything about Chinese people. Do you think he wins his case or did he lose his case?
I'm pretty sure you lost it.
He lost it. What the court did was say, okay, yes, there's nothing in our laws that says Chinese people specifically, but it's embedded. They said when the law says Negro, mulatto, Mongolian, or Indian, that means basically any other group can be placed into those categories. And that's why, like in the documentary we saw where Chinatown originally in Los Angeles encompassed a street that was called Calle de los Negros, which is Spanish for like a street of like Black people, or probably Negro would have been the word used at the time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Black people lived on the street at any point. Right? That word could have been used to encompass anybody as long as they were not white at the time. That word could be used to describe them. And that's basically what the court is agreeing with. It's saying, yeah, those categories involve just anybody that we can put into that box. Right? So the court is legally deciding who is white and who is not. Right? Now, even after 1882, right? We saw that although immigration from China did not completely stop, it is reduced. It is heavily reduced. And there are some clear results out of that, right? Because the railroads still needed work. They needed more work. So where are the railroads going to get workers once the option of China is gone? They can no longer get a significant influx of workers coming from China. So where are they going to get their workers? One of the answers is on the screen, but there is another answer. There's lots of work still all over the US, and especially in the West. They actually end up turning to Mexico. Right. There is, and I'll discuss this in a few minutes, but there is a wave of immigration from Japan coming to the US after the Chinese Exclusion Act. So Japanese immigrants begin arriving in the US in large numbers after 1882, in part because of the need for cheap labor. Right. But the other place that the railroads specifically turn to is to Mexico. And Mexicans, they get hired in large numbers to work on railroads. So this is after the big railroads had been built. You still have all kinds of routes being built all over the US. So that work does not end after the railroad that connects the East and the West is built. And so they're bringing in Mexican workers, and it actually ends up reshaping the Midwest, right? A lot of us tend to imagine the Midwest as very white, right? Because that's a lot of times the way that the Midwest in the US gets represented in films and television. We tend to see it as heavily agricultural, heavily rural, and heavily white. Well, some of those things are, might be correct in terms of the majority, but there's also significant diversity within the Midwest. One, because there are big cities in the Midwest, right? So there is a significant Black population, especially in cities all over the Midwest. But the other thing is that there are heavily Mexican towns all over the Midwest, in places like Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, Kansas. You have towns that actually have large Mexican populations, and these are Mexican populations that are not new arrivals. It's Mexican populations that have been there for 5-6 generations. And the reason they exist is because of these Mexicans that were hired by the railroads. Right? They're hired by the railroads, and while at first there were primarily men being hired, they end up coming with families, right? And actually that was incentivized by the railroads to try to convince Mexican men to come work for them. They would be offered housing. Now, housing for these Mexicans that worked at the railroads was not like the houses we would think of even today. They were offering box cars, right? Like the cars that actually make up the trains when the trains are moving things back and forth, right? They have box cars. So I want to show you a picture of it here. Let me scroll down. Maybe not. Okay, let me go over here. Box cars. Images. So this is what I'm talking about. They offered these kinds of things, these box cars, to Mexicans that they could turn into homes. And actually, it turns out these Mexican families would use them. They would live in some of these box cars, sometimes in one, or they would place several together to try to make a bigger home. And they created entire communities in different cities all over the Midwest. While the men were often, traveling with the railroads where they were needed, their families, their wives, their children would stay put in some of these cities. When the rail work was no longer needing work, like when the work was done, what a lot of these workers decided was just to stay. They decided to stay in the Midwest. And so sorry, I'm reading, making sure I'm getting the questions in the chat. Okay. Is they just stay in the Midwest. So you have these towns with a heavy Mexican population in these places, right? In Kansas, in Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, all over the Midwest. And we don't necessarily get to see them unless you end up in these places, but they're very much there. The other big result out of the Chinese Exclusion Act is the beginning of creating a border patrol agency, like an agency dedicated to patrolling the borders and trying to stop immigrants from crossing the border. So they're not there initially to restrict like Canadian or Mexican immigration. They're there to restrict Chinese immigrants coming into the US, or that's the initial push to create a border patrol agency. So let's come back to California into the Midwest. So just to point out that after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, then is when this large chunk of the American Southwest becomes American territory. But as you already know, and as I've mentioned before, there's already a significant number of Mexican people living in this territory, right? And something has to be done with them, right? Because where are they going to fit in? Especially in the context of Chinese exclusion, then where do Mexicans fit into the racial category, both culturally and legally, right? Because you think that at this point, California was becoming very heavily multicultural, right? There is a significant number of Mexicans already here. In fact, they make up the majority initially. A majority of people living in California were Mexican. There's a significant number of indigenous people. Well, even though there had been the indigenous population in California had been devastated by Spanish colonialism, there's still a significant indigenous community in California at the time. And you have Californios, these Anglos that had been coming from the East Coast in the US to California. And now you have Chinese immigrants coming in and Japanese immigrants coming into California. So it seems like this is the beginning of a thriving multicultural California, right? Of course, things are going to be a little bit more complicated, right? Because although the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did grant Mexicans suffrage, it granted them citizenship, American citizenship, right? It was supposed to be automatic. And with citizenship was supposed to come full legal rights to all of those Mexicans staying in the Southwest. Well, legally, there's an attempt to kind of reduce the number of Mexicans in the American Southwest and to reduce the political power they have, right? Because when the treaty is passed, all of these Mexicans automatically get the right to vote because they're citizens. With that, because they make up the majority of the population, then they're getting a large number or a large amount of political power. In fact, in the first elections after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a majority of towns and cities in California elect like all Mexican men to the role of mayor, to city boards, all of us, all public officials are primarily Mexican after the first elections, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That changes though, that changes. Like 3 elections after that, like 5 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the case is completely opposite. You have almost no Mexicans being elected to public office in California. It is primarily white men being elected to office. Right? So how did we go from that, from all Mexicans being elected to public office to basically none, very few, all white people being elected to office in California? Well, it's a very direct result. It's a result of policies meant to exclude Mexicans out of political power, right? One of the things that was done was try to get these people to sell their lands or to basically dispossess Mexicans who owned a majority of the land in California. Like a majority of the land that was owned in California was owned by Mexicans. So there are policies put into place to try to change that. One, offering land to white people coming from the East Coast, but also through taxation. Under Mexican rule, landowners in California paid taxes based on the amount of cattle they had and the amount of crop they were harvesting every year. Right, so you pay tax based on kind of the results of the work you've done. Right, so if you'd had a bad crop year, for example, if there'd been a drought or something had devastated the crop, right? If you have a farm, you're growing crops on it, but it's a bad year, you don't have anything or you grow very little, then your taxes are going to be smaller because you didn't have enough crop to make money. Right, so you're not paying any or very low taxes to the Mexican government. Right, or if you are a cattle rancher, which was another big industry in California, right? If some disease devastates all your cattle, and so like a third or a half of your cattle all die, the taxes that you're going to pay the Mexican government are based on just the cattle that survived. Right. Well, that changes when California becomes U.S. territory. Instead of being taxed on the crop or the cattle that you have, now you're taxed on the land, on the amount of land that you have. So now it doesn't matter if it's a bad harvest year or not, whether you were able to make money or not, you're paying price based on land. Right. So what do you think happens? Do you think that people are going to be able to pay their taxes to the American government, or are they going to have a hard time paying their taxes? A hard time, much harder time than they had paying their taxes to the Mexican government. Yeah, because now it makes no difference, right? Whether you've made any money or not. And there are years that's the danger or the hardship of like farming and of cattle racing is that it can be unstable at times. You're dependent on the weather. You're dependent on a lot of things that are hard to control. And so there comes a time where farmers in California are not growing very much, right? And they still have to pay high taxes. So what do? Let's say you own a ranch, you own a chunk of land in California, you had a bad harvest year, so you don't have very many meat crops to sell, you're not making much money there. Maybe it's also a bad year for cattle. So you end up losing a bunch of your cattle. So you really don't have that much money, but it's time to pay your taxes. And you don't have enough money left over to pay your taxes. What are you going to do? You have to pay these taxes. You don't have enough money. Yeah, Hubert?
I want to say you can file for bankruptcy, but they would probably try to move.
Yeah, so a lot of them don't want to, right? They don't want to move. They don't want to forfeit their land. That's the tricky thing, because owning land is incredibly important to these people, and they don't want to lose that land. So initially, what a lot of these Mexicans do to pay their new taxes to the U.S. government is they take out loans, right? Loans on the land, because they have something that's very valuable, the land. And they think, well, maybe 1 year is bad, but next year won't be as bad. So with the hope that next year they're going to be able to pay the taxes and the loan that they've just taken out, they just take out loans. Aha, April put it in. You had the right idea, April. I would borrow money possibly, but I'm not sure whether these people would find these resources to find money. Yes, and they would have, because they're the elite. They're the elite of California. They own land, and they control the politics of California. So initially, they do have the Mexicans living in California do have the option of taking out loans. They will be, in part because they own land and because they have political power, right? But okay, you take out a loan to pay 1 year of taxes. What if the next year's really bad too? Maybe next year, maybe the weather was fine, but you had a bunch of, I don't know, like, I was going to say pirates, but somebody comes and they steal a bunch of your cattle. You lose a bunch of your cattle. And now maybe you have a little bit of money to pay some of your taxes, but not enough. Now you have a loan and you don't have enough for your taxes. So now you're in a worse place than you were before. Eventually, if that happens enough time, then you max out the money you can get, you can borrow. And that's what happens to a lot of land-owning Mexicans in California and in the Southwest. Eventually, if they can't pay back their debt, if they can't pay back their debt, they can't pay their taxes, they are gonna lose the land. Right. And what often happened with that land, the Mexicans lose possession of the land, and then the bank or whoever owns it next sells it, and they sell it for pretty cheap. Sell it for pretty cheap, and it gets bought by white people, by Anglos. It gets bought by Anglos. And so what happens is within that 5 to 10 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a majority of the landowners go from being Mexican to being white. And that gives them a lot of political power in California. Oh, Caitlin, I see your comment. So where would they live after they lost their land? So most of them do end up staying in California. Some of them go back to Mexico if maybe they have resources or family or something back in Mexico to go back to. But most of these Mexicans that were in California and in the Southwest at the time don't maybe have lost their connection to Mexico or don't want to lose the connection to the US. And so typically they stay and they end up being farm workers. That's kind of the work that they had been doing before. So they end up working in farms as laborers, just day laborers. Some of them end up going to the mining towns, right? Mining, especially if you're a man, it can seem like at least a temporary way to make some money. But what is happening in the mining towns, and this is happening not just to Mexicans, it's happening to the Chinese immigrants, to the Japanese immigrants, is that mining towns at this point are a scam, basically. People are going to the mining in hopes of making it rich, right? But it's done. The majority of the gold that you can dig out of the ground at that point has been found. And if you're a new miner, you go into the mine, right? You go to this town and you're like, okay, I'm going to work at the mine. Well, the owners of the mine are going to tell you, great, we need work. We need men to go in there and keep digging. But you need tools for that. And guess what? The mine owner is going to sell you those tools. Do you think the mine owner is going to sell you those tools for cheap? Nope. The mine owner is gonna sell you those mining tools for cheap. They're gonna sell them to you at a high price. And let's say you just lost your land from debt and taxation. You don't have the money to buy those tools. In fact, most men, whether or not they'd had a hard time before or not, don't really have the money to pay for the things they need to work in the mines. But so the mine owners are going to offer it on as a loan. Okay, I'll let you borrow the money to buy the tools you need, and you can work off that debt in your work in the mine. Does that sound familiar? What does it sound like? Doesn't it sound a lot like sharecropping? It's the same mechanism that is used to keep the free Black population in the South connected to those cotton plantations. It's very similar. What a lot of these men end up doing is just falling more and more into debt to these mine owners. And so they end up just in debt peonage, where they're just tied to these towns and to these men. And again, you could run away, you could try to run away, default on your loans, but because the mine owners have a lot of political power and a lot of legal power, they basically can have authorities come looking for you. And so it's actually quite difficult to escape this kind of debt. So a lot of the Mexican population that had been doing really well in California when it was in Mexican hands ends up not doing really well within a decade after California becoming American. Right? At the same time, California begins to sell itself to the rest of the United States and to the world. Right? Like the idea that that everyone in the world has of California comes from or begins to be built in the 1880s, right? Because if you travel anywhere, or if you talk to people that come to California from other places in the US, from other places in the world, what do people think about California? What's their mental image? Like, what do people expect when they come here for the first time? No? Hubert, is that a hand for this one, or I think it might be left over from the other one, from the other question?
Might be from the other question. Sorry.
Okay, no, but okay. Don't people? I know when I've traveled abroad and I tell people I'm from California, people automatically they're like, "Oh my goodness, Hollywood! How many celebrities do you know?" No?
Yeah.
Or when people come to California, that's one of the first things they're like, where are the celebrities? Where's Hollywood?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was in North Carolina for like 4 years, and that was like the first thing they would say, like, "Oh, LA, like, how many celebrities have you seen?" I'm like, "Oh, none." Like, it's pretty big. It's like it's really rare. Yeah.
Right. And like, okay, everybody knows Los Angeles, like, but Los Angeles encompasses a huge amount of different areas. You're like, yeah, I don't live near the celebrities and they don't come over here. Of those of you here, how many of you have seen or know a celebrity? I'm not going to ask you, Hugh. You can just raise your hand. How many of us know celebrities? Hubert knows a celebrity or has seen one. Okay, some of you have seen celebrities, right? I'm like, my biggest celebrity sighting was at South Coast Plaza in Orange County. I saw Kobe Bryant once. I didn't have the guts to go say hello or anything. He was with his wife and they didn't look very approachable.
Was he really tall?
He was really tall. Yeah. Yeah. That's why I noticed the first, because I was like, I'm not like out looking for celebrities, right? So, but he was walking towards me and he and his wife's also very tall. We're walking towards me. Well, maybe she looked next to him, but walking towards me, and he was really, really tall. Yeah. But like a celebrity sighting is noteworthy even amongst people in California. It's not because it doesn't happen every day, right? The other thing yeah, CJ, is that a
Oh no. Sorry,
okay?
I was raising my hand for sorry.
Okay, no. The other thing people always know about California is the weather, right? Everybody thinks where everyone is at the beach, that we need to be at the beach, sunbathing in bikinis. Isn't that the other main like vision of California people have? That part is maybe a little bit true, right? We do have better weather than a lot of other places. And that is what Los Angeles specifically was using to sell itself to the rest of the world. They're saying, hey, you should come to California because this is a sunny place. But they're also adding it's a sunny, healthy place. So they're selling Los Angeles as a modern oasis, right? Come over here, come find a spa to relax, to get some sun, escape the cold weather of the places you are at, come to California. It is hilarious, right? Now, do we still sell ourselves this way? What do you
Yes, to some degree.
Right. It's funny because a lot of if we live here, we maybe don't have that particular image or don't necessarily do that. But I'm like, if you look at have most of you these ads are kind of old now, but do you all remember the old California ads?
Yes.
What are the main things in those ads?
It was always a beach scene, and then it cuts to like the San Francisco Bay, and then it cuts to like just all the touristic spots that gives it that LA vibe, California vibe.
And right, and when you say that, everybody knows what an LA vibe is. So let's look. Let me see if I can play one of these to remind everybody. Oh yeah, this is one of the ones I automatically think of when I think of these ads. So let me lower the volume. So let's look at just a quick seconds of this ad.
People think life in California is all fun and games.
But it's really serious business.
We have board meetings.
Board meeting.
Lots of board meetings.
We run with the big dogs. Everything's a huge production.
We're on the road a lot.
We're really just a bunch of pencil pushers.
We work with some real characters.
Hey, it's a dirty job.
But someone's got to do it.
So if California seems like your kind of work,
we've got one question.
When can you start?
Start your trip at visitcalifornia.co.uk.
So that was a UK ad, actually. So that ad ran in the UK. So these ads were really popular when Schwarzenegger was governor. But even I think under Governor Brown, we had similar ads. It's the same thing, right? And there's also that element, like the spa and healthiness seem to be a common theme throughout the decades of how California sells itself, along with the celebrity now, and then the attractions, right? Universal Studios was there, Disneyland, those things. But at the time, well, even today, when we say how accurate is that picture of California? Is that what your California looks like on the daily basis?
No.
Like,
I
so
think
we say pretty accurate.
they're missing like the high taxes. What do you call this? Like the homelessness and all that all over LA and downtown in the valley.
Yeah, all the more negative or more complex issues in California. Yeah, there's
traffic.
And the traffic. Why is like one of the key experiences of being especially a Southern Californian is traffic. And that is nowhere in any of these ads or any of people's visions of California is the traffic there. At least it's a very different version of California. Now, at the time in the 1880s, it's probably even worse because a lot of this healthy modern oasis is even less accurate. And it's a problem for a lot of political leaders in California. Especially a problem are ethnic communities. Right, because one of the main places right at the center of Los Angeles is Chinatown. And also like the Mexican community and the Japanese community, but especially Chinatown because it's right in the middle, right? It's central in Los Angeles at the time, was seen as the rotten spot. In fact, in LA's county, like LA council meetings from the 1880s. So these are the political leaders of Los Angeles meeting on a regular basis. That is how they describe Chinatown, as the rotten spot. That phrase comes directly from the minutes of their meetings. So what are they going to do? What are they going to do with Chinatown? Because at the time it was quite dirty. It was violent. We've already seen that violence was a regular part of Chinatown, but it was also quite dirty. It had regular outbreaks of diseases, like just there were things that ran around because that's what happens when there's not a good health implemented there. So what is Los Angeles going to do with these things. One could try to regulate, Kendrick. That would be an interesting approach. They claim initially what they decide that they're going to do is they're going to say Chinatown is not actually part of Los Angeles. It's not us. Chinatown is like a foreign element. It's a foreign Chinese. It's not Los Angeles. Right? Initially, that's what they do. Eventually, right, they're gonna, all that gets moved in part because of the violence. But here's the thing. Chinatown was experiencing, violence, and also it was dirty. It was dirty. People were not coming around to clean up the streets. A lot of things were just getting dumped outside. In fact, human excrement would be just like thrown out into public areas. But why? Why were these people doing it? It's not like people like living in dirty areas. I don't think anybody really likes walking out of their apartment or their house and seeing dirty streets. Part of the problem in Chinatown was sewage. During this time, they were starting to build sewage systems all over Los Angeles, right? Because it's a huge health problem. You can't just have human excrement, you can't just have poop in the streets, because if you're in close contact with poop, it leads to disease, right? If you're just throwing out poop into the streets, the other thing that it's a problem is water. You're polluting the water, right? If people are throwing poop into the LA River, and that's where people get their drinking water, if you're going to drink that, it's going to make you sick. So at the time, one of the things Los Angeles promises is that they're going to add sewage lines into Chinatown, right? To clean up a lot of the dirt and the outbreak of disease that's happening in Chinatown. Do you think the LA City Council made that a priority?
No way.
Much like a lot of people would argue today, they kept making promises, because it's not like people living in Chinatown were not saying we need this. People were asking for it. Nobody likes living in dirt, and nobody likes being sick all the time. And it's a major problem, especially for babies and infants. If you don't have clean drinking water, if you don't have clean, healthy conditions, babies don't survive, infants don't survive. It's a huge problem. So people in Chinatown were trying to get the city to come in and add sewage. Well, every year, the LA City Council promised that they were working on it, that they had a plan, it's coming, it's coming. It took the city of Los Angeles 30 years to put in sewage in Chinatown. In the meantime, other parts of Los Angeles got sewage right away. The parts of Los Angeles where most white people lived tended to get the sewage lines first. The other thing the city of Los Angeles, the other problem they needed to deal with was air quality, right? The more people you have living in a concentrated area, the more the air quality is going to be a problem. Now it's cars, smog, factories, things like that. You don't have cars necessarily the way you have them now, and you don't have factories the way we have them now. But even horses and cattle create an air quality problem. One, because the excrement, where are you putting the poop from all the horses and cows? If there's not a proper way of disposing of that, it's probably just staying there, and it creates an air quality problem. This was true all over the world, by the way. Cities all over the world were having to deal with this issue, even before modern industry, for modern factories and cars. So they actually do pass an ordinance. The city of Los Angeles passes an ordinance that says that that you cannot have more than 500 cubic feet per person. So to try to spread out people living together. right? You want to spread out the city of Los Angeles. You don't want too many people living in a small space. So we gotta, sorry about my dog. You force people to spread out. Why would that not work in places like Chinatown or in, in other ethnic communities amongst Japanese, where Japanese immigrants are living, where Mexican immigrants are living? Why would that not work?
Because they want to stay close to who they know or have like a close circle.
Yeah, that could be one of the issues, because people who tended to create Chinatowns and these other ethnic enclaves, these ethnic parts of town, because they want to live close to people that have similar backgrounds, speak the same language, etc. Yeah. The other big issue, though, is price of housing, the cost of housing, right? In these ethnic communities is where housing tended to be the cheapest. So even people that didn't want to live in close proximity to a bunch of other people tended to be stuck in these ethnic parts of town because that's where it was cheapest to live. The city still has to deal with it. They've passed an ordinance. You can't have too many people living in it like this. How do you think they're going to enforce this law or this new ordinance? Where are they most likely to go send the police to enforce this policy? They tended to try to enforce it in Chinatown. Some of the other ethnic parts of LA were actually kind of left alone. They were primarily focused on Chinatown. They would try to get people to leave Chinatown by enforcing this ordinance. Whereas in other parts of Los Angeles, they were more likely to just like not care, turn a blind eye, less likely to enforce that law anywhere else. They were primarily focused on Chinatown. Why? Why are they so focused on Chinatown, do you think? The anti-Chinese feeling, right? The racist, like xenophobic, anti-Chinese feeling. They see the Chinese as the primary problem. Yeah. Yeah, and they can take advantage there. Yeah. Yeah, the courts have already ruled that these people have limited rights, right? So selling California, the way that Los Angeles sells, the city of Los Angeles, and the way the state sells itself is a way of promoting whiteness, right? Of selling whiteness. As a result, a lot of the history of California that gets emphasized, right, is the Spanish past. So they skip over the Mexican part of California, and instead they emphasize Spanish history, because the Spanish can count as white. The Mexicans are a bit in a more troublesome spot at this point. So instead, they skip the Mexican part and focus on this was Spanish land. Also completely ignoring indigenous communities and the fact that this was indigenous land. We're going to skip that. We're going to skip the Mexicans, and we're going to focus on the Spanish. And so one of the things that does get emphasized at the time was the missions, right? We have this history of the missions. But the missions are not taught as places where indigenous people were enslaved or forced to work. Like the missions are imagined as Christian buildings. Look at the building that the Spanish were able to do here, right? Is that still how they teach the missions, do you think? Does anybody, if you went to public school in California, you had to have a unit on the California missions. All California public school children have to have a unit on the California missions. were we all taught about Indigenous communities when we had our unit on the missions? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, but I went to like a Catholic school, so I just had a feeling that, the missions and the Catholic schools had to do it either way.
Okay. April says no. Have any of you taken the like historical tours of any of the missions?
I have.
What was that mission that did they talk about the enslavement of Indigenous people or forcing Catholicism on them?
No, actually the story is that we were just in the area and we saw San Juan Capistrano because we were on our way from LA to San Diego, and my dad was just sort of like, oh my gosh, here's a mission, and we just checked it out. And I just remember it. Well, I grew up Catholic, and Mexican at the same time, so everything was just kind of how do I say, like, repetitive. Like, I already knew all this stuff. Like, I already knew like how Catholic church looks and how Catholic mass goes. But I just remember seeing how pretty it was. Like, I saw like the koi fish ponds and like the difference between these chapels and a regular Catholic chapel. Like, yeah, they had like stained glass and stuff, but like everything was like engraved in gold. And I had no idea. I had no idea the horrors that actually went down in these missions until I came to college, and I figured out, like, oh my gosh, like, these were mass murdering sites. Like, when people really think about it, these were sites of genocide, not kind of like this Catholic godly what do they call it, like a coming of age, I guess you can say, like kind of like there's a word for it, I just can't think of it right now. Enlightenment, there you go. Kind of like, this is not some Catholic enlightenment, this is a place of hatred and sorrow.
Yeah, and that is the way Indigenous communities view the missions, and they talk about the history that they emphasize. But a lot of the missions actually don't do a very good job of telling a more accurate version of the missions, in part because a lot of the California missions are still working churches. Like, masses are still held at the old missions, right? I have been to the San Juan Capistrano church, but it's been 5 years, and what I remember of that one was like there were sometimes plaques talking about this is where Indigenous people lived. And at the San Juan Capistrano, there was one mention of slavery, of the enslavement of Indigenous people that I remember, but it was one mention of it in one plaque in one part of the mission. On the other hand, well, no, actually, along similar lines, I grew up next to a mission. I grew up in Ventura, California. It's north of Los Angeles on the way to Santa Barbara. And there's a mission there. And that was, since I also grew up Catholic, that was the mission I went to, like, do my first, not my first communion, my confirmation. I went to mass at that mission. And that mission has artifacts. They have a little tiny museum. It had Indigenous artifacts there. But other than that, at that mission, there was nothing else. Nothing else about the darker elements of missions. And so it's interesting. Some missions I've heard do a better job of discussing that. Sometimes they will have partnership with Indigenous communities, and so they will work to do a better job discussing the what actually went on at missions. But most, I think, tend to not do a really good job of it, or tend to just brush it off, or do just a little bit on it as opposed to emphasizing it. So it's interesting when you go. So if anybody, whenever you get a chance to, I don't tell people not to go to missions. I'm like, could take the historical tour. Even the self-guided tours can be very interesting. So okay. How are you going to do this, though? How are you going to promote whiteness with so many non-white people in California? We're going to talk more about this, race covenants. At the time, in the late 1800s and then early 1900s, up until very recently, they had these race, what people call race covenants, which is if you wanted to buy a house, if you were going to buy land in certain areas, you had to be white. And in the contract you sign when you buy that house or that land, you had to promise not to sell that house to non-white people. You could only sell your house or your land to other white people. Yeah, Elise?
What about for those who were like Mexican, but they were white passing? Did they have like that? Could they just lie and be like, hey, like I'm actually white? Like,
Yeah.
I know maybe they have an accent or something, but I can imagine that if you're a white person, if you're a white passing Mexican, I mean, you must have had like some upper hand, right?
Yeah, you probably could. Yeah. So that is yeah. A white passing always offers a more opportunity. So yeah, you could. Yeah. So these race covenants, for example, Glendale and Southgate were two of the areas that were notorious for these race covenants, where if you bought houses there, you had to promise, well, one, you had to be white, and then you had to promise that you would only sell your house to another white person if you sold. And they enforced that, right? So this is, so some areas that had some of these covenants have changed, others have not. But okay, let's talk a little bit more about the Mexicans that were here. Initially, even though there is a clear move to take political and economic rights from Mexicans in terms of race, right? In terms of looking at people as a race, Mexicans was seen as not a big problem. Right. One, in terms of comparing Mexicans to other immigrant groups, right? Especially this was at a time where there was a lot of immigrants coming into the US from Southern Europe, so from Ireland, Italy, right? So you have those large immigrant groups coming into the US, especially into the East Coast, and they are seen as not white. Right. You also have, the Chinese immigration, Japanese immigration, those groups are seen as non-white. So in comparison to those other groups at the time, Mexicans living in the Southwest were seen as not as large of a problem. Right. Until a new wave of immigrants are going to come from Mexico. There's going to be a new wave of immigrants coming around the 1910s due to the Mexican revolutions. And so that's going to be a bit of a different category. But initially, they're not seen as a racial problem. Right. And so if we take the groups of people that were living in California and in the Southwest at the time, this was the racial hierarchy that existed at the time. Whiteness at the top, right? But below whiteness were Mexicans, right? Then Japanese, then Chinese immigrants, right? So at the bottom of the racial hierarchy and out here, it was Chinese immigrants that are at the bottom, right? Everybody else felt in the middle, and with Mexicans being slightly more preferred than like the Japanese or the Chinese immigrants. This is so weird, by the way. I'm like, when you learn California and history, is really weird because sometimes it matches. Well, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think this racial hierarchy, do you think is the same hierarchy today, or do you think things have changed? Or is that too controversial a question? One, much more racial variety in California, right? It's much more diverse than this today. But how similar do you think? Does anybody think it's still very similar, or key changes? Europeans still on top. That's one thing we can probably say. Very interesting though, because the idea, right, for a long time we've known that the demographics of the United States in general are changing, where white people in the US within the next 2 decades will not be the majority. And has actually, I don't remember what the current statistics are in California, but I think we've already reached that in California, where white people are no longer the majority in California. And in the decades, from the 90s, probably even before 80s to into the recent, this was seen as a huge problem, that whiteness was not going to be the majority. So I wonder, though, I don't politically and kind of culturally, if how much this is still true. Part of why Mexicans are seen as not as much of a problem was because people that needed laborers were making the case that Mexicans are not as bad. Right? Employers were arguing that Mexicans were not a cultural or an economic threat. Right? They made the case. One, they were saying, hey, they're actually legally white. According to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the laws that the US had agreed to, they're citizens, and in the laws where whiteness is defined, Mexicans are not legally others. They technically count as white. So that was a case that was emphasized by a lot of people that needed workers, that needed cheap labor. The other thing is that a lot of employers were emphasizing that Mexicans were here temporarily. Right? These are people that are coming in temporarily for work. Therefore, what employers were arguing is, don't discriminate against them. They're only here for a little bit. They'll go back. And that was, for some people, true. Some people were coming for work, and their plan was always to go back. Were people actually going back, though? Is some people were, but a lot were choosing to stay. A lot were choosing to stay. So there was some people that were just coming back and forth, but a lot were also staying. But this was the case that a lot of employers made. Right. At the same time, won't spend too much time on the Japanese yet, but after the Chinese exclusion, there's a wave of Japanese immigration to the US, especially to California, right? And especially to California because of the agricultural work, right? A lot of the Japanese immigrants that were coming to California are working in agriculture at the time. There was a need for cheap labor. Mexicans were also working in agriculture, but so were the Japanese. How do you think they're received in California? Are they welcomed? No. It's the 1907-08 Gentleman's Agreement was a negotiation between the U.S. and Japan to try to reduce the amount of immigrants coming to the U.S. from Japan. Right? Japan agreed to allow the U.S. to place limits on that, and Japan agreed to try to not make things harder for people to come to the U.S. And even after that agreement, California passed land acts in 1913 and in 1920 that were meant to prevent Japanese immigrants from purchasing land in California. If you were a Japanese immigrant, you could not legally buy land in California. Right. And the land acts, wording in the land acts was specifically says that these laws are meant to keep California white. Like a lot of times today we talk about, microaggressions, about racism that's more hidden, about wording that's racist but not explicitly racist, like about how people hide their racism, right? But the period we're talking about in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there's nothing hidden about it. They were very explicitly. That tells us a few things. One, it was not controversial, right? That a majority of people here are agreeing with these attitudes, right? It doesn't mean no one was fighting back. It just means it's generally they're not afraid to say these things out loud, right? It's generally accepted, right? But the fact that they had to pass two different land acts tells us that maybe they were not 100% successful at enforcing the acts and the attitudes, right? One of the things that Japanese immigrants did to work around the land acts was to buy land in their children's name, right? So Japanese immigrants could not buy land, but their children were US born citizens. And you could not prevent the children from buying land. So sometimes a family would buy land and everything would be in the name of the child that had been born in the US. Right? So there were ways to work around some of these laws so that some families end up doing really well. Because of this wave of Japanese immigrations, also in the agricultural work that it's emphasized, we still have some farms especially in Southern California, but all over California that are owned by Japanese families, and they can, these are generations of Japanese families that have owned these farms, and they can go back to the original family immigrating around this time. So I know there's in Orange County and LA County, there are Japanese-owned farms that have been in a Japanese family for a lot of generations. So there were ways around this, but the general attitude here and the legal fight, right, over who could own land is very clearly about race. Right? They're very worried, though. White people in California were very worried about Japanese immigrants because Japanese families at the time tended to have many children. They tended to have many children because they were working in agriculture, right? And usually for any group working in agriculture, it's beneficial to have more children. It means more hands that can work, that can contribute to the farm work. Right? That is true everywhere in the world. Here, though, when there's this panic over trying to keep California white, then that becomes a problem, right? That these families have such high birth rates, that they're having a large amount of children. Because they're having a lot of children, one of the things that gets used to attack these Japanese families, especially women, is that they were bad mothers. Because if you have that many children, right, if you have 5, 6, 7 or more children, you're not taking care of all of them. How could you possibly be able to take care of all those children? Therefore, you are a bad mother. It's kind of like they were looking for excuses to criticize these families, to criticize these communities. The other thing that gets used to attack these Japanese communities, these families, was to accuse them of being disease carriers. That they were carrying diseases and infecting other people with disease. Now, are they making all of this up? Generally, yes. There were outbreaks of diseases amongst Japanese farmers because that was common where people working near domesticated animals. Right? It is common for people working with domesticated animals to be at risk for diseases because a lot of diseases can jump through domesticated animals to humans. Because a lot of these farmers were like first-time, home farm owners, a lot of them used all the money they had to buy the land to farm, to buy the tools for the farming, and then didn't have a lot of money left over to build homes. So a lot of times white people were looking at the homes of Japanese farmers and saying, look at those terrible homes. And because of the way they looked, they thought that these were unsanitary homes. See, this is where those of you that know more about public health and disease know even more than I do. There's also outbreak of typhoid amongst agricultural communities, people working with in berry farms and in celery farms. There were waves of typhoid outbreak at berry and celery farms. And so, and that is, those were farms where Japanese agricultural workers tended to work, tended to be working in berries and celery at the time. And there were typhoid outbreaks in berry and celery farms. Now, here's the thing. In these cases for the berries and the celery, those were not owned by Japanese farmers. Those farms were owned by white farmers or companies, white-owned companies, right? But the workers tended to be Japanese workers. So there were these typhoid outbreaks, right? That was true. Does it mean that it was the Japanese workers' fault that there was typhoid? No. When you look at why those typhoid outbreaks occurred, it is because of unsanitary conditions, right? And largely it was the unsanitary conditions in the living quarters where the Japanese workers were living. Why were these unsanitary conditions? Well, because a lot of the housing was created by the companies that own these farms. And the people that own these farms, they provided the housing for their workers. So a lot of this housing was unstable housing. There was no sewage there. There was often no access to clean water in these areas where they would put the housing for the workers. In that case, then it was easy to predict that there would be outbreaks of diseases there because you don't have access to clean water, you don't have sewage, you don't have good housing available there. No good housing, it's not being maintained, and there's no resources to keep these places clean. So they become health concerns. Right? That health concern then gets used by people that want to label the Japanese in this case as disease carriers. Right? The situation, the racism and the legal actions already being taken in the West helped contribute then to, in 1922, the Supreme Court says that Japanese immigrants are not eligible for citizenship. Okay. So it starts off in small ways and then ends up leading into kind of bigger legal decisions that end up playing an important role. This part's important. It'll become important later in the 1900s. Why? What's going to happen to the Japanese in the US later? In fact, about 20 years after the Supreme Court says they're not eligible for citizenship. World War II and Japanese internment. Yeah. So we tend to talk about Japanese internment in terms of the war and the attitude towards Japan at the time. But a lot of those racist attitudes were not new. Right? A lot of that is built on what was already racial prejudices and legal prejudices against the Japanese community. So, okay, this leads us to the Mexicans, because I The reading I assigned, one of the readings I assigned for this week is all about Mexicans being attached to being disease carriers. And the reading talks about the connection to typhoid, right? Because it happens in the same way in which the Japanese are being stereotyped as being dirty, right? The Mexican community is also going to be placed in that same box, right, as being dirty and disease carriers. Well, a lot of that attitude can be traced to this typhoid outbreak in 1916, right? Between June and October, there's a typhoid outbreak within Mexican communities in California, right? And typhoid was being transmitted via lice and tick bites. So, maintaining a clean, clean habits, regular showers, access to clean water are really important for battling typhoid outbreaks, right? Because you need to avoid lice and ticks. How do you do that? Well, access to water, showers, soap, cleaning. Having good cleaning habits can help prevent the transmission of typhoid, right? And it's happening not just at the farms where the Japanese workers are working. In California, there's an outbreak of typhoid in a railroad camp near Palmdale, right? Where the community was largely Mexican, right? At that point, the railroad workers were largely Mexican, at least at this camp in Palmdale, right? Los Angeles, people in Los Angeles freak out. Now, we all know Palmdale is not that close to Los Angeles. Like, even today with roads and cars, the drive up to Palmdale can be a bit much. No? Does anybody drive up to Palmdale or drive from Palmdale to LA? Is that an easy drive? Maybe it's just me. I'm like, maybe I just hate driving, but I find that that's not an easy drive. And maybe I've only done that in a very boring. It is very boring. It's not the easiest of drives. So why would Los Angeles freak out about a typhoid outbreak in Palmdale within this railroad camp with a lot of Mexican people? Oh, Angeles Forest, Jacqueline, thank you for the tip. I might take it because I really do hate that drive. But why? Why would Los Angeles freak out about an outbreak of typhoid in a railroad camp near Palmdale of primarily Mexican workers? Why do Angelinos freak out? Well, more specifically, why do white people in Los Angeles freak out at the time? Yes, Christian's putting it in the chat. Mexicans work through railroads so they could spread it quickly. And they're not even worried about that because a lot of those railroad workers are not actually like coming to Los Angeles at the time, but they're worried. Yes, these Mexicans in Palmdale have typhoid, and there's a lot of Mexicans in Los Angeles, right? They're thinking, the typhoid outbreak happened because they are Mexican. Those Mexicans over there are proof that Mexicans are dirty and full of disease. That was the idea. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that. I know sometimes the way I say things, I'm like, might sound funny, but I'm like, the idea that white Angelinos had was that the outbreak in Palmdale was proof that Mexicans were dirty and full of disease. And they're looking around Los Angeles and they're seeing a lot of Mexican people in Los Angeles, and they're really freaking out that the Mexicans in Los Angeles are about to infect them with typhoid. And so every Mexican they saw was a suspect. It was a potential danger. And so they launched all these hygiene campaigns. They send volunteers into Mexican communities to teach Mexican families how to be clean. What do you think about that? What do you think about volunteers going into Mexican communities to teach Mexican families how to be clean? Does this sound like a good way to, a good campaign, a good way to put volunteers' time into? This is the thing, it is extremely demeaning. Imagine somebody coming into your house and telling you just because of your skin or ethnic background or racial background that you need to be taught how to be clean. Yeah. On top of it, at the railroad camp, the reason there was the outbreak was because workers there did not have access to clean water, and they did not have access to things like soap and disinfectant. It was not that people didn't want to use soap. It's not that people didn't want to take showers or that people didn't want to be clean. It's that there was no clean water. There was no soap. There was none of the things you need to create a clean environment were not there because the railroad companies would not provide them. And if you're out in Palmdale at the time, you're not near a place where you can easily access it, or you might not have the money to access it because you're working for the railroad and they're not paying very much. So, and this is one of the things that continues to happen throughout history, we make cleanliness about morality, right? Good, clean, healthy people are morally superior people. Dirty people that live in dirty places, where there's constantly disease, people that are always getting sick, those are people that have shown a moral failure. They are doing something wrong. When in reality, there's a bunch of other factors that go into it. A lot of times says, wait a minute, do people have access to the things that would help them maintain a clean, healthy environment? Right? Do they have knowledge about, yeah, Jacqueline, do they have information about Lyme disease, about tick bites, about this information? And the thing that as a historian is really frustrating is that I still see a lot of that language today, right? Like around COVID-19. This was the language that was used to make sure that refugee seekers at the border were not entering. So until very recently, the US was not allowing refugee seekers to wait for their trials, for their court hearings in the US. Before that was typical. If somebody came to the US border and said that they had a case for refugee status, that they applied to be a refugee, they would have a court hearing and they would be allowed to enter the US and wait for their court hearing in the US. So until like literally months ago, everybody was being stopped at the border, at the Mexican-US border. And the excuse that was used to do that was COVID-19. We can't allow people coming in with COVID-19, and allowing these people that are seeking refugee is going to put the health of Americans at risk because they're going to bring COVID-19 in. Even though There was no evidence that people asking for refugee status were testing positive for COVID-19 or were actually putting anyone at risk for it. But that's the thing. Fear doesn't need to be based on any reality in order to have very real consequences. Right? Here's the difference, though, in the way that the Japanese community was treated versus the Mexican community. For the Japanese community, there were no hygiene campaigns. Like, they were not sending volunteers into Japanese communities to teach them about cleanliness. They were only implementing these hygiene campaigns within Mexican communities in Los Angeles. Why? Why do you think they were only interested in educating Mexicans about cleanliness and not Japanese immigrants? Why? I'm gonna stop sharing for a second because this will be the question I ask everybody. So get credit for the points for today. You have to tell me why. What do you think? A guess. I'm just asking you for your guess. If it's a question, I'm asking you for points, and you have to guess why. The question is why does Los Angeles only implement hygiene campaigns in Mexican communities and not Japanese communities? I'll put it in the chat. Because these campaigns are coming from the city. They're not coming from just people. They're coming from the city. So the question is why?
I think I'm having like a little bit of like difficulty understanding the question, just like some background. So you're asking, at the time, there's two groups of people, Japanese and Mexicans. Only one of them has hygiene campaigns, yet they're both suffering from typhoid fever.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there were outbreaks of typhoid in Japanese communities, in Mexican communities. The city of Los Angeles was afraid of both of these outbreaks, right? But they only implement these hygiene campaigns. They only try to make the situation better in the Mexican community. I'm like, and I will take all the wrong answers. If you're really unsure, at least put some things in the chat so that I know that you were here and I can give you the points. You can even say that you were not sure. Diona, yes, please. Diona, I see your message, please.
Is this the moment in time where Mexicans were working on the railroad?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, see, some of you have very interesting, completely logical answers. I think some of you are way more logical than even the city of Los Angeles was at the time. I think some of you give too much credit to people. Okay, whatever your answer is, or whatever you're in the middle of typing, just push send. Just push send, put it in there. If you if you're struggling, just say I don't know, because it's a tricky question. It's a very tricky question. But the answer is, this is the answer historians looking at it, and look when they're looking at the attitude of people, right? What are the Los Angeles City Council talking about at their meetings? How the culture of the time, when you put all of this information together, the answer that historians, especially Dr. Molina. So one of the readings for today was written by Natalia Molina. She's a historian, and actually she's at UC San Diego. But what Dr. Molina is like the expert on these issues. And this is another book she wrote. But the answer is that Mexicans were seen as capable of learning to be clean. That's what the city of Los Angeles believed, what a lot of white people believed. Mexicans were capable of being taught to be clean, whereas Japanese immigrants were not even capable of learning cleanliness. They thought, no, the Japanese people, we just need to get rid of them. The Mexicans, we can teach how to be clean. Yeah, Jacqueline, right? Yes, potentially be clean by white standards, whereas the Japanese could not. What this tells us, right, the bigger thing that it's telling us is that Mexicans have the possibility of approaching whiteness the most. Can they ever actually be white? We're not sure, but they can be the closest to white of any of the other groups. The Japanese, on the other hand, according to these white racist attitudes, could not. There was no possibility of them being white. Right? This is the same attitudes towards Chinese immigrants. They have no possibility of being white, or of even being close to it. But Mexicans could. Maybe April, maybe it's a language issue. Maybe they saw Spanish as being closer to English, whereas they're listening to Japanese or Chinese, and they think those are too different. Yeah, it's odd, right? And it's odd because I'm like, it's odd to us too, because the attitude we have about these groups of people today also has shifted, right? I feel like more common to see today, and it's not an absolute, but more common is to confront the model minority myth with Asian Americans. We tend to have a lot of positive stereotypes about Asians and Asian Americans. But I don't know, it's complex, because even at the time, it's not like everybody was that way, right? It's not like Mexicans didn't experience any racism. That's not true. It's just like, oh, these people are closer and these other people are not as close, right? But it's a similar attitude to, for example, to the Irish. Initially, the Irish, not white. Not close to white. They're also considered dirty, full of disease. They were living in areas of towns in the East Coast that were heavily populated. They're usually living in close quarters, packed into small apartments that were not well maintained, with also had sewage problems, cleanliness problems, these type of things. And yet the Irish are absolutely able to become white. Like, they became white. The Irish went from not being considered white in the US to being considered white. Same thing with Italians. Italians were not considered white when they first started immigrating to the US. But they did within a generation and a half, most Irish Americans and Italian Americans became white. And then in American culture. So at the time, the idea was that maybe Mexicans can become quite white too. Did they become white? Most no. Most no. But that's then the factor is the history of immigration. But very interesting, right? So, okay, I'm going to stop here. I don't want to pack too much because I want to talk about housing and redlining. I know some of you already know about that. So I'll discuss it next week. But any questions? I'll stop the recording.